A TV host publicly mocks Morgan Freeman. Then he responds in a way that shocks everyone. Then Morgan Freeman responds in a way that shocks everyone as a TV host openly mocks him. Reflecting off the polished glass table, the brilliant stage lights lit the sleek studio and created lengthy shadows over the packed set. The audience hummed with expectancy, the air charged with enthusiasm. Morgan Freeman was the guest tonight. He was a legend whose voice could call for silence, respect, even wonder. From respect or status, does actual power originate? Comment 1 for respect. 0 if you believe status defines power. Ethan Miller, the host, was working at the height of his career. Late-night television had made him one of the most discussed personalities, thanks in great part to his keen wit and provocative humor. He lived on stretching limits, on getting a rise out of his visitors, and today he had a scheme to make one of Hollywood's most revered personalities the punchline of a joke. Wearing his trademark understated grace, Morgan sat across from Ethan as the cheers subsided. The conversation went easily, lively, full of stories about Morgan's illustrious career. Ethan then judged it was time to change gears. With a chuckle, sitting forward in his chair, "You know, Morgan," he asked, "I've always wondered, do you actually have to think before you speak, or does that deep voice just make everything sound profound?" The watching laughed. That was a little stab, a test. Morgan only gave a small smile. He had visited here once beforehand. Seeing a gap, Ethan persisted with an amused voice. "I mean, seriously, you could read a cereal box and make it sound like the Ten Commandments. Ever feel like people just assume you're wise because you talk? So, slowly?" Though not all around the studio, laughter burst forth. Some laughed since they thought it hilarious. Others chuckled since they feared not to. Then, midway between jokes, Morgan leaned forward, rested his palms on the table, and said, "That's a curious idea, Ethan." The room froze. Morgan Freeman had already seized command of the discussion in a few words somehow. Ethan assumed he was preparing a joke, but what Morgan said next would silence the whole room. The set was bathed in almost unreal radiance as the studio lights burned down on the sleek, contemporary backdrop of the evening show. The room was charged with the kind of excitement that accompanied a live crowd ravenous for entertainment, ready for their next great laugh. Ethan Miller, America's most talked-about late-night host, stood at the middle of it all. Ethan had developed his profession on ruthless honesty and keen intelligence. He was the person who dared to express aloud what everyone else was thinking, yet pushed limits. His humor was a weapon, and he used it like an experienced warrior, demolishing public personalities, politicians, and celebrities both. And tonight he was fixated on a fresh goal. Morgan Freeman. When Morgan walked onto the platform, the audience had screamed with delight. His presence alone commanded the space. He moved with a serene confidence, his demeanor cool, his steps deliberate. The public loved him. Everybody thought Morgan Freeman was great. Ethan, though, was not here to praise him. Ethan arrived here to generate news, and nice interviews did not produce headlines. Ethan smiled and pointed to his guest, "Morgan Freeman, ladies and gentlemen." The viewers burst once more in cheers. Morgan nodded politely toward the gathering. "It's an honor, really," Ethan said, his voice pleasant, too warm, the type of warmth that covered something harsh under. To have a real legend on the show, a man whose voice alone could make reading a cereal box sound like a life-changing event. Comedic laughing. Morgan laughed, used to jokes of kind of nature. Ethan bent slightly, his smile broadening. "Let's test that actually, shall we?" Once more the audience laughed. Ethan's voice had changed. Something about it suggested more than simply lighthearted banter. Morgan our eyebrows, but said nothing. Ethan went behind his desk and pulled a cue card. "Let us see what happens when Morgan Freeman reads the directions on a shampoo bottle." The audience let out a blast. Some laughed honestly, while others hesitated. Morgan, on the other hand, stayed still. He watched Ethan waiting just here, and the energy in the room changed at that same time. Ethan expected perfect compliance right away. Things was how things went. He established the tone, made the jokes, and the visitors followed along. But Morgan did not grab the cue card. Rather, he slanted his head slightly and examined Ethan with a gaze not of fury, but of something else totally. "That was the kind of glance you mentioned. I could see exactly what you were doing." Ethan's smile stumbled for half a second, just long enough for the cameras to record it. Laughing as he waved the card in the air, he covered it rapidly. "Come on, Morgan, let's have some fun. Just give us one of those deep, wise-sounding narrations. Lather, rinse, repeat. Sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood monologue, doesn't it?" The audience laughed, but this time there was a pause under it, an uncertainty not present previously, because Morgan was not playing a game while Ethan was still doing so. Morgan stretched out slowly, deliberately for his water glass, not for the cue card. He drank something. The loudest sound in the room was ice clinking on glass. He put it back down, then turned to face Ethan. "Ethan," Morgan began, his voice calm, calculated, "do you ever wonder how many words you speak in a day?" Blinking, Ethan startled me. Probably a lot. I talk for a living," Morgan nodding. "And among all those words, how many do you suppose people really pay attention to?" The room went quiet, not as Morgan had spoken up, not based on his reprimands of Ethan, but he had done the one thing Ethan hadn't expected. He had made everyone think. Ethan laughed, pushing back in his seat. I would want to think they pay attention to all of them," he answered softly. Morgan only gave a simple smile. "That is the essence of words," he remarked. "They carry weight because of the person who speaks them, not just because they're spoken." The quiet became more pronounced. Ethan no longer wore a smile, neither the viewers nor the performers. Ethan was losing control of the chamber, first in his career. Ethan conducted himself professionally. He was skilled in turning around and guiding a discussion back in his advantage. He thus feigned a smile and leaned back, seeking to re-establish his control. "Look, Morgan," he continued laughing, "I'm just saying, sometimes all it takes is a deep voice to make something sound wise." Morgan let out a little breath. "And sometimes," he observed, "all it takes is wisdom to make people listen." The room broke out in cheers, not chuckles, claps. At first it was subdued, a few scattered claps from the audience, a low murmur of approval. Then it developed. Ethan thought it was slipping away. This was no joke these days. His stage was no more here. He had not expected this lesson, and he could not avoid it either. Ethan turned once more, holding his cue card somewhat tighter. "It's only a bit," he remarked. "No need to get too deep about it." Morgan's nodded. "Of course," he answered. "This is just words, right?" Ethan nodded quickly, glad the time appeared to be passing. But then Morgan leaned in just the most minutely. "Tell me something, Ethan," he urged. "If it's only words, why do they matter so much?" Ethan started to open his mouth. Nothing surfaced. Because the crowd was seeing him differently today. The man who had spent his whole career making others the punchline was now in the middle of a course of instruction he had not asked for but really needed. Moreover, Morgan Freeman, he was not even making an effort. He was exactly as he had always been, the kind of man whose words made silence significant rather than merely filling in activity. Ethan had spent years making visitors into jokes, but in a few minutes Morgan Freeman had turned the joke back on him in a way he never would have seen. The studio was tense enough to cut with a knife. The once roaring laughter had quieted to an uncomfortable silence, and the room's energy changed. Ethan Miller sat stiffer than he had lately, his customary cocky smile faltering at the margins. He was used to running the room, setting the conversational pace, guiding his visitors exactly where he wanted them to go. But tonight he was not in control. Across from him, Morgan Freeman sat with unflinching presence but incomprehensible expression. He was not obliged to interrupt or raise his voice. He had no need to play into Ethan's pranks or crack a joke. He simply lived in a way that made every word he spoke more meaningful than anything Ethan had said all evening. Ethan could also be losing his hold on the room, first in his career. He was not about to let that happen, though, not without struggle. Ethan feigned a giggle and shook his head slightly, as if he were attempting to dismiss the incident. With his voice still trying to have that fun edge, "Well, Morgan, I have to say, you sure know how to turn a joke into a philosophy lecture." he added. Morgan merely smiled. And yet, here we are. He continued, his voice calm, unhurried, a striking contrast to Ethan's attempted lightheartedness. The audience chuckled, not at Ethan's joke, but at Morgan's seamless ability to hold the upper hand. Ethan sensed the shift and tried again. Look, man, I think we both know this is all in good fun, he remarked, his fingers pounding against the desk, a telltale sign of nervousness. I mean, come on, you're one of the most respected actors in the world. People worship you. You've got nothing to prove. Morgan gave a tiny head tilt. Nothing to prove to you, he responded naturally, and the audience laughed once more, not at Morgan, but at Ethan. The host grabbed the cue cards in front of him more firmly. This was not what he had intended. This was not as it ought to be going. He had to change the dynamics before losing total control. He thus resolved to intensify. All right, Ethan murmured, his smile coming back, but this time there was something more pointed under it. Since we're getting deep here, let me ask you this, Morgan. Do you ever get exhausted? You know, being everyone's wise old narrator? A couple in the audience laughed, but it was forced and uncomfortable. Morgan lifted an eyebrow. Exhausting? He asked once again. Yeah, Ethan said, bending forward, his eyes shining with mischief. I mean, man, do you ever wake up in the morning and think, damn, I wish I could just sound normal for once? This time, there was no laughing. The audience sensed the change before Morgan started talking. This wasn't a joke anymore since then. These days, this was an attack, a badly veiled barb at who Morgan was, his manner the very core of what made him respected. And Morgan Freeman was not a man who allowed such lapse. He gently sighed and leaned back in his chair somewhat. Ethan, he began, his voice bearing a weight that made the whole room go still, do you know what the difference is between speaking to be heard and speaking to be understood? Ethan grimaced slightly, taken aback. What? Morgan nodded as though he expected that answer. You speak a lot, Morgan said, his words careful as though he were building something unbreakable with each sentence. But really, how much of what you say counts? The room became quiet. Ethan moved with unease. The cameras were whirling, the lighting was fantastic, and he felt instantly vulnerable in a way he never had. But Morgan leaned forward, staring him squarely before he could reply. I'll tell you a secret, Ethan, he added. It's the weight of the words that makes people listen. It's not the voice. And in that instant, Ethan Miller at last experienced what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a course of instruction he could not joke his way out of. Ethan was not laughing for the first time all night. All night for the first time he lost control. And the spectators? Today they were seeing him differently. This was hardly the assured, charming host one had tuned in to see. This was a man who had just been deprived of his most simple fantasy of authority. Also Morgan Freeman? Morgan had only lived in his reality, not done anything. The viewership began to whisper. A few looked at one another. Others moved about in their chairs. Ethan experienced it all as well. The closing in of the walls. On him, the eyes, his own words becoming weighty against him. So he tried to laugh it off in a last-ditch effort. He forced a grin. All right, then added, I get it. I messed with the wrong guy. Lesson learned, huh? Morgan, however, wasn't finished. With a calm, patient, but sharp voice that chilled the room, Did you? He said. Ethan's smile came down right away. Since that question lacked a rhetorical quality, it was a challenge. And he didn't have an answer. Ethan sucked hard, his throat dry. He said nothing at all for the first time in his career. The audience watched in rapt attention, some leaning forward, some whispering. They weren't here for a late-night joke anymore. They were here for a reckoning. Ethan began to open his mouth, closed it then, because there was nothing left to say. Morgan sat back, studying him, his expression unreadable. At last, he spoke as well. Ethan, the thing about words is, once they leave your mouth, you don't own they no more. The quiet was almost intolerable, because everyone in that room knew exactly what Morgan meant. Then Ethan, Ethan had recently come to see he had spent his whole career spewing words into the world without ever giving their weight any thought. Years of dictating talks had made guess the punchline. But tonight, in a few brief minutes, Morgan Freeman had created the joke he would never remember. Ethan had created his empire with words as weapons, but today he had at last found a guy who understood how to make them cut deeper than he could have ever done. Not for Ethan was the applause. It was just for the moment, for the shift that had occurred before the eyes of millions watching at home, for the course of the real-time instruction on one of the largest late-night stages on Earth. Ethan sat there still clutching the cue cards in his hands, but for the first time they seemed meaningless. The customary enthusiasm, the power he had over the room, the assurance of knowing he guided the course of the conversation, it was all gone. The audience was still watching, the cameras still running, but for once he lacked the advantage. The applause continued, slow at first, then getting louder. Individuals were not honoring his wit. Their cheers were not for another joke. They were appreciating the seriousness of what had just occurred. Morgan Freeman had just dissected Ethan's entire core without ever speaking out, without ever needing to rebel. Rather, he had shown the difference between speaking with purpose and just to be heard, and Ethan was now to deal with it. He thought about pushing back, tossing another joke back in his favor for a second. That was his daily habit. It was that which had brought him notoriety. But he understood something as he looked about the studio, at the audience, at his production crew, at the faces that no longer laughed. He could not have joked his way out of this. It wasn't accounting. He cleared his throat as the silence felt weighty down on him. "Well," he murmured at last, his voice softer than it had been, "that wasn't precisely how I thought this conversation would go." A few laughs rippled through the assembly, but they were not the same type of laughing as they had been. This has nothing to do with entertainment. This was recognized. Ethan slumped back in his chair, shaking his head slightly. He turned to face Morgan, who sat there patiently as always. Ethan said, "You know, I've spent years talking," but he said he didn't think he had spent enough time listening. Morgan nodded as though he had known this all along. "That's a start," he stated simply. The audience burst once more, this time for the change that had just occurred rather than for Morgan or Ethan. This went beyond simply a late-night prank gone bad. This was about the weight of respect, the power of words, and the infrequent occasion when someone in public view truly learned a lesson in real time. And for the first time in his career, Ethan Miller was not the one wielding the microphone. He was the guy at last listening to what another person had to say. Morgan buttoned his suit jacket with natural ease as he stood to go. He was not triumphant. He wasn't gloating. He had only followed his usual behavior, let his words speak for themselves. Before moving off the platform, he glanced back to Ethan, leaving him with one more thought. "Words shape the world," he stated. "Choose yours wisely." And he left Ethan alone on the stage, still seated behind his desk, still carrying his cue cards, but profoundly changed in a way no script could have ever ready him for. The cameras were still rolling. Still under observation was the world. But Ethan remained motionless. Through this story, we realize that true influence doesn't come from speaking the loudest, but from speaking with meaning. Ethan Miller had spent years believing that words were just tools for amusement, that as long as people laughed, nothing else mattered. But tonight he learned the hard way that words can either build someone up or tear them down. And when you're someone with a platform, with a voice that reaches millions, that responsibility is even greater. Morgan Freeman didn't just put Ethan in his place. He reminded the world that dignity, wisdom, and respect will always be more powerful than arrogance and empty words. Because in the end, the true mark of a person isn't how many people they can make laugh. It's how many they can make think.